Hello everyone, welcome to this week's topic in key issues on justice, reconciliation and peace building. I've met some of you. My name is Lydia Gitao. My research focus is on trauma healing, trauma recovery and peace building, linking the two. I've been working on that, and that's pretty related to our topic for today, justice, reconciliation and peace building. And we all know, we all understand the basic idea of justice, and meaning rendering to each person what they deserve, that is fair treatment, and that is very basic to peace. At the beginning of this semester, Jake presented a talk on peace with justice to you, and basically the idea of peace with justice is the mantra of CPACs. We cannot begin to talk about peace without justice, but we realize that we need to have a deeper understanding and application of justice when it comes to peace and conflict, and that's why we will be focusing on it this week. We need to have that deeper understanding. Why? Because where people are in conflict or fighting, where we have probably one group is experiencing oppression from another, and each group is feeling justified, they deem their actions to be justified, then we need to be asking ourselves the question of whose justice are we talking about? Whose justice is in consideration here? And so, because in that case, we find there will be competing accounts of justice from the two groups, and the competing accounts of justice could even lead to a clash and end up leading to violence. And so it becomes an important question, whose justice are we talking about? How should we then go about seeking and pursuing justice in the context of plurality, in the context of groups fighting, in the context of enmity? And that is going to be a major focus and interesting discussion this week. And one of the others that you will be engaging with this week, and especially, I mean, as you look at the readings we have posted on the Blackboard site, one of the others, Wolf, talks about the need to see our judgments about justice and our struggle against injustice through the eyes of the other. And he says, even the manifestly unjust other. That in that regard, he's talking about that concept of mutual embrace that he discusses in that article. So the idea that we need to be engaging with what the other person, when we think of conflicting groups, what the other understands justice to be and feels justified actions. And so, in that regard, then we find justice becomes intertwined with the idea of reconciliation, especially when we think of reconciliation in terms of relationship. One of the other authors that you will be engaging with this week, Asefa, in his very interesting article on reconciliation, looks at reconciliation as restoration of relationships, and the idea of coming together and creating a community. So Asefa will be one of the other authors you'll engage with. And so we understand that justice is important. So the question is not whether justice is done when it comes to peace building and reconciliation, but how it is done. Is it done in a way that builds or restores relationship and also facilitates the creation of community? That is what is most important in our discussion this week. We find that reconciliation then tends to take the concept of justice a step beyond the idea of fair treatment, the idea of giving each person what they deserve. So it takes the concept of justice beyond that, and includes that important aspect of relationships, of restoration of relationships, of creation of community, of warring groups in conflict coming together. And that is the approach that is referred to as restorative justice, a concept that I believe you have come across, you have probably engaged with or read and engaged with in other contexts. And it's particularly relevant when we think of justice in relation to reconciliation, in relation to peace building. So restorative justice is not just about responding to wrongs done. It's actually responding also to the effect of the wrongs, the harm done, especially on relationships. And it's not only in terms of relationships between individuals and between community, but also between also national and international relationships. In other words, people and the government, people and the international community. We know that in situations of conflict and mass violence, for example, like even the genocide, for example, the case of Rwanda, the people do not feel just offended by the group that perpetrated the violence. In this case, the Tutsi do not only feel offended and distrustful of the Hutu, but also they may have a feeling of a feeling of they can't quite trust their government to take care of them. So then reconciliation in that case then involves restoring the relationship between the people and the government. Can they trust the government to take care of them? Can they trust that there will be structures in place put in by the government to take care of their needs? So restoring relationships not only through between individuals and communities, but even beyond that. And so the focus of justice when it comes to reconciliation, when it comes to restorative justice, then is on relationships at all levels. Now, some of the groups that have been engaged in the work of justice and reconciliation in relation to peace building have been using the approach of forgiveness. And forgiveness is an approach that is pretty controversial when it comes to issues of peace building and reconciliation. Why? Because there's always been that question of, if you're talking of forgiveness, then is justice served? Does forgiveness tend to, in a sense, compromise justice? And that's an interesting question that you will also probably engage with. It will be interesting to hear your thoughts about that. The question of, is justice served when we talk of forgiveness in relation to reconciliation? And some of the groups, some of the people that advocate for this approach of forgiveness in regard to reconciliation talk about it in terms of sacrifice. And they see forgiveness as sacrifice, as a kind of risk that the people are taking in order to make way for dialogue, for the establishment of trust and mutual respect between warring groups, between groups that are in conflict. And so the idea of sacrifice becomes crucial. One of the professors that uses this approach and advocates for it in her scholarly work, Professor Gobodo Madikizela, who was also involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, talks about it as the only fitting response to the horrors committed by the perpetrators of the apartheid regime. And she says, I quote, "No amount of punishment can restore a sense of symmetry that would balance what they have done," that is the perpetrators. "And there is no mental disposition we can adopt towards them that would correct the sense of injustice that their actions have injected into our world." And she's saying that there is no matching justified, reasonable action that the survivors, the victims, can do that is fitting or that can match what has been done by the perpetrators. And the only way, the only response that they can have is something that goes beyond a matching response, a reasonable response, a fitting, justified response, something that goes beyond that. And she looks at forgiveness as that kind of response that goes beyond a matching one, a reasonable one. And in that regard, then, forgiveness becomes a sacrifice. Forgiveness is a sacrifice. It goes beyond what has been done. And notice that she's not talking about it from a religious point of view. Actually, forgiveness, when it comes to reconciliation and peace building, seems to have left the pulpit and is being considered scientifically. It's actually hit the labs and it's been examined emotionally, scientifically, psychologically, biologically, if you like, and looking at how does it lead to healing, how does it lead to peace building. And so it will be very interesting also to get to hear your views and your thoughts about this in relation to situations of conflict that are in our world today. And another critical step another critical thing that forgiveness is seen to do is rehumanizing the other. We all know that in situations where we have two warring groups, and probably in considering theories of conflict, you may have engaged with this idea of dehumanization, probably in one of the classes of WEDIS on theories of conflict, the idea of dehumanization, where we find the oppressor, in order to justify their actions, they tend to dehumanize the other. And in this regard, they justify their actions by considering the other person not quite a human being. That has been in the history of all the conflicts that we know about. But in this regard, then, we are talking about also the survivors and the victims tending to, in a sense, dehumanize the perpetrator by looking at them and reasoning there is no way they could have treated us the way they do as human beings. They must have been inhuman to treat us like this. And so the approach of forgiveness seems to be embracing the perpetrator as a human being. It's like they're extending the platform of what they call humanity, what they consider moral, to the perpetrator, to the other, in this case the perpetrator. And in that sense, then, they are sacrificing. They are going beyond what would be expected. So in that regard, forgiveness becomes a step of rehumanization. And it will be interesting to hear your thoughts and to see how you think that may apply or may not apply in situations of conflict.